In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus does something pretty odd. He intentionally heals a man's withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath, which according to some circles of Jewish tradition, that's forbidden. But why does Jesus really do this? What is the deeper message that often gets overlooked? You need to realize where this is happening. Once I realized that, everything else clicked. See, this is not just a random miracle to confront their idea of Sabbath. It's something much deeper. So in this video, we're going to make sense of this profound miracle by observing 7 key details that often get overlooked. And if we miss these, we're going to miss the hidden message. So let's jump into Matthew chapter 12. Hey, welcome to Above Reproach Ministries. I'm Jason Camacho. We're in Matthew 12, verse 9. If you're new here, welcome. I pray that you become a subscriber today. And if this video does bless you, like this so it reaches more people. And if you've not watched the rest of our Matthew series, it would be helpful just to get context. The foundational understanding moving forward is really helpful. So Matthew 12:9 says, "He went on from there, and he entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, 'Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?'" And you're like, who's the they? And I think it's likely the people up here who condemned the disciples for doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath, that is, the Pharisees. Okay, that's likely who's in view here. Not only, but at least it's the primary audience Jesus is directing these statements towards. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. They already accused his disciples and he defended them. Let's trap Jesus. And he said, "Well, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out?" That concept of falling into a pit and being lifted out all throughout the Old Testament, of how much more value is a man than a sheep. So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That is not in question. And we talked about the law of preserving life and doing what is good to benefit and preserve the life of others in the last teaching. Go watch that. And then he said to the man, after addressing them, "Stretch out your hand." And I find it fascinating that Jesus could have done this miracle anyway. He's already done miracles just with a word. He's done it by touch or someone touching him or just him releasing it through a word by his authority. In this particular situation, he seems to intentionally involve the man and let him have a role of participation. And so the man stretched it out and it was restored, healthy, just like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him, and that theme just continues to snowball into the next section. Here's the first observation, is entering the house. Entering the house. This brings us back to verse 4, if you remember, the idea of Jesus referencing David, who entered the house of God, who ate the bread of the presence that the priest gave him. This is the second controversial thing Jesus will do on this specific Sabbath day. So we need to understand the way that synagogues kind of functioned, how they kind of arose from the exile and the dispersion. It was a response to the first destruction of the temple, and it allowed for corporate worship and gathering and teaching to take place in specific communities, regardless of your distance from the temple. And so they existed as extensions of the temple in their respective areas, to kind of allow for more of that involvement within specific communities, regardless of distance. So everything Jesus has said and will say about the temple thus far now is going to be contextualized for the synagogue, what the synagogue functions as and represents. So he's entering into it as if he is making a statement. I want us to think about this. Him entering their synagogue, doing what he does, kind of confronting what's going on there, that stands as a statement generally about the temple by exposing the local synagogues and their poor condition all across Israel. It's as though the extensions of the temple are defective, as will be demonstrated with this event and others, which means that the core, the central focus, the temple system is also dysfunctional. And this is why Jesus will make statements of judgment about specific cities. He did that in chapter 10. He did that in the last chapter. He's doing that here because individually, these places stand against God. They have defected. They live in unbelief. They reject Jesus. So collectively, as a nation, when you put them all together, the majority of the nation of Israel has grown corrupt from the inside. even though there's always a remnant. But Jesus here is not just confronting synagogue in this specific region, but he's going to different cities, which is a kind of, which is symbolic of his judgment about Israel and its corrupt temple system nationally. You might say, to use this metaphor, the branches are corrupt and withering, which indicates that the center is corrupt. And in the next section, Jesus furthers this idea of houses being plundered or kingdoms plundering with the idea of the strong man, which represents demons. And the demons are being plundered by the stronger man, that's Jesus. He's casting them out. And Jesus makes it clear, whoever doesn't gather with me is scattering. Whoever is not with me is against me. So he makes it pretty clear that the unbelieving house of Israel has sided with the kingdom of darkness, with demons, and is being plundered by God's kingdom along with the powers of darkness. So we'll get to that later on, though. And we'll especially see that when Jesus enters the house of God towards the end of Matthew's gospel, which should be a place of worship. But when he gets there, he has to overturn tables to confront the hypocritical religious system that has defected over time. So all of that, I know it's like, that's not obvious in this text. When you look at Matthew and kind of get an aerial view of the whole gospel and more of a macro, you really begin to see how all these things fit together. But it goes on, and a man was there with a withered hand. So Jesus entering synagogue is parallel to David entering the house of God in verse 4. And in the next section, Jesus entering the house to plunder the strong man. There's a lot of that language. And a man was there, and they asked him, kind of using this man to lure and trap Jesus. They saw their opportunity. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? If you're such a master teacher, let's see if you break the Torah and the tradition of the elders. So they wanted to accuse him. And it's explicitly stated here. So in a similar way, Israel is, you might say, withering, right? There's so much to this. In Isaiah's prophecy, you have the arm of God, the hand of God, which the Messiah has to functionally be in the New Testament, Jesus, because Israel, that extension of Yahweh to the nations, has kind of withered and failed and fallen short. And Jesus picks up the broken pieces. So it's as though Jesus has come to restore withering Israel and the remnant to its God-ordained calling and ideal condition that they couldn't attain on their own. And so the question, second observation, is what's lawful versus good. This is all a question of, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they're still stuck on what is lawful, as prescribed by the tradition of the elders and the rabbis' teaching and interpretation of Torah. So there are a couple of passages I want to bring you to that are helpful just in understanding the idea of what is lawful. Okay, Paul kind of develops this idea later to the New Testament under the New Covenant. He says, all things are lawful for me, because we are now righteous apart from the law, which gets into a lot of details, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. And in the context, he's talking about food and what you're allowed to eat and whether it's been devoted to idols and statues and demons behind those things. And then in chapter 10, verse 23, so there is a category for, hey, all things are lawful, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good or useful or beneficial. 1 Corinthians 10:23 repeats this idea. All things are helpful, not all things, or lawful, rather, not all things are helpful. So if we just take the permission of Jesus further than it's intended to go, you find yourself in some really deep pits. But not all things are useful for building up, right? So that's how we define and qualify what is useful or beneficial. Does it build up? And unfortunately, as they're qualifying what is lawful here in Matthew 12, 2 times, when they accuse Jesus or the disciples, they're not looking for what builds up. They're looking to tear down and accuse and expose. They're just looking for prey. This is all about accusation. Jesus and his disciples are just being accused, and the religious leaders are trying to find fault rather than loving, showing mercy. The irony, though, is they're making false human judgments about the one who is their judge. It is the ultimate irony. So verse 11, he said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, like if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you won't take hold of it and lift it out? And I really want us to pay attention to the language Jesus chooses to use, the image he chooses to employ. Here's the third observation, is the lost sheep. Jesus is very clearly making a connection between this lost sheep and the person he has just or will heal in the next verse. Almost as though this man in his withered condition, not to make a statement about his spiritual condition necessarily, but in that sense he's kind of disadvantaged. He needs help physically. His hand is withered. So whether he is spiritually deficient and lacking the life of God and far from God, that's not really the question. Either way, I think Jesus is also, not that every analogy and metaphor and every detail parallels to reality, but I think in this case, the image of a pit is intentional as well, and he's stating that this man, being with a withered hand, is in a pit of his own, and he needs help he can't climb out himself. His hand is messed up, and so he needs the good shepherd to pull him out and show mercy and compassion rather than accuse him and be like, well, you're probably just a sinner, or your parents probably sinned, that's why you're like this. So we see Jesus actually refer to Israel as lost sheep. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 6, he says to the disciples, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that's not a new metaphor. It's not a new image. We see that actually in the Old Testament. Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, Jesus uses the same language. He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? So in Matthew chapter 12, using the image of a sheep, it's not random. He didn't just pull it out of his pocket and be like, what do I got? So he says, won't you take hold of it? Now, like you're the one rescuing it, right? Wouldn't you do that on the Sabbath? And that wouldn't violate your concept of the Sabbath day rest. Here's the fourth observation, is the preserving of life and not self. To celebrate the release of our brand new Bible study course on mastering repetition, we're going to have a free 7-day Bible study challenge that runs from now until September 5th. If you need some fresh motivation to jump into the scriptures again, this is your opportunity. Each day you'll be sent a unique hand-picked scripture with a specific task designed to help you develop one key Bible study skill, the skill of recognizing and tracing repetition in the Bible. This will train your mind to study the Bible the way it's intended to be. This is the easiest Bible study skill to develop, and it's the most rewarding. And there are so many dimensions to this. That's why I created a brand new 32-session course that focuses on this key Bible study skill. This 7-day challenge will deepen your studies, whether you're a new Christian or an experienced Bible student. Sign up on the website or click the link in the description below, and I'll see you in the 7-day challenge. Let's get back to the video. This is the language of seizing hold of something that Jesus spoke of in the last chapter. If you remember in Matthew 11, he spoke of those who violently try and break hold or grasp onto the kingdom and find their way in by works and efforts and works of the flesh under the law. They're trying to seize hold of the kingdom by their self-righteous deeds. But this language here of taking hold of something, it's not used of forcing one's way into the kingdom in a negative sense, but it's seizing hold of those who have need and bringing them in. And the religious system has become so self-focused, so prideful and hypocritical, not to make a sweeping statement about all the religious leaders and scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees, but to say the majority of the system and the elite have become defective. And instead of looking outward, they are just looking inward. And if they look outward, it's to judge and prop themselves up. And that's why Jesus uses the image of, I'm the great physician, and people who are sick, I've come for them. Not the people who think they're healthy and don't need help. Right? So Jesus is presenting himself and him helping this withered-handed man as the opposite of the religious leaders. In chapter 23, Jesus will say of the religious leaders, you refuse to go into the kingdom, but you also keep people from entering themselves. And this is similar to what we'll see later in this chapter. I can't wait to get to the unforgivable sin. It confuses people. But where Jesus speaks of plundering the enemy, this right here, when he heals this man in verse 12 and 13, it's a kind of plundering of the kingdom of darkness, where Jesus is taking hold of someone and taking that person from its current condition, from its current location, the way you would do for a sheep stuck in a pit. And Jesus is preserving life or helping and benefiting. And ultimately, he'll do that on the cross when he lays down his life to preserve the lives of his people, rather than doing what the religious elite are doing of his day, which is hypocritical self-preservation at the expense of others. And they're so self-concerned and self-preserving. They're just violently trying to take hold of God's kingdom, keeping people out. And another similar passage to cross-reference in terms of this self-preservation at the expense of others, rather than looking outward and benefiting life, is in Matthew 10. Jesus says, whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, right? And then Matthew 16:26, we see another similar statement. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world? The idea of gaining life, right? And forfeits his soul. What will a man give in return for his soul? Like, y'all are caring for the wrong things. Not caring for the things of God. You don't have the heart of God. In fact, right here in verse 7, Jesus already quoted from, Hosea 6 and Micah 6, to say, y'all lack the true sacrifice God is looking for. The heart of God revealed in the law, mercy and compassion. You're lacking that. So busy with the tedious details of the behaviors. So here's the fifth observation, is God's value system. God's value system. Because look, how much more value is a man than a sheep? If that's the case, and we're working with God's value system, and it's good to preserve and benefit life, regardless of the tradition and laws that you're so tediously working with, then it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. You're not breaking any law. You're not breaking tradition. You're not violating like the actual heart and intent of the law. So this is what Matthew chapter 6, verse 26 says. Look at the birds of the air, how God feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Jesus has already emphasized the value God has for people by comparing them to birds. Same in chapter 10. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. And Jesus will continue to bring up how much God values you here in chapter 12 by comparing people to sheep, right? And so the idea is, we're going to see this in the parable of the lost sheep, where the good shepherd chases down even one, regardless of what day it is. The work of God doesn't stop. The work of salvation and benefiting life and glorifying his name, advancing his kingdom, that doesn't stop on a specific day. That's why there is the distinction between common labor and the actual priestly ministerial labor of the priests in the Old Testament. So I think it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That's the proper interpretation of the Sabbath. That's why it's instituted. So one should be led to conclude, the Sabbath will never work against what promotes and gives life in the name of God. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he didn't have to do this. I pointed that out earlier, and I'll show you why. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy, like the other. We've seen this language of restored and healthy in regards to the eye, if your eye is healthy in Matthew chapter 6, or Matthew 5, I forget. Or, Jesus coming to bring healing to the sick, those who have illness, as the great physician. So here's the sixth observation, is the work of God. I want us to think about what the man was doing, who's surrounding him, on what day he's doing it, and in what setting. In faith and obedience, this man does his part in the miracle. Not to say that his miracle hangs on his part. We don't know what would have happened if he didn't do it. We just know he did. So you might say that according to their tradition and interpretation of Shabbat, that he did a kind of work. According to the will of God on the Sabbath, though, it's not a violating work, it's a God-ordained work. Since this is all about what work is allowed on the Sabbath, remember, John chapter 6 says the work of God is believing in the Son. And technically, that is part of what the man is doing. He's taking Jesus at his word in obedience and doing what he says. And remember, one of the most, maybe you didn't know this, one of the most common images of rebellion and unbelief in the scriptures is this high-handed language of seizing or taking hold of something that is forbidden or off limits, reaching beyond your God-given station. We see this with the angels and the authorities and Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. It's the first original sin of humanity, is to reach out and grab what God has forbidden in disobedience and rebellion out of pride. So since this is all about what work is allowed on the Sabbath, I want us to think about this. This is very similar to what the religious elite are doing. in a counterfeit kind of way that God has not authorized, they are reaching beyond their God-given station to try and seize hold and grasp onto the kingdom by their works of the flesh, by their obedience to the law, by their own self-righteousness. And so the man doing this in faith and stretching out his hand stands as a confrontational image of the rebellion that most of the house of Israel is engaging in. And this man stretching his hand out in faith is a counter opposite image of the original sin in the garden. And this is why I want to link this to Philippians 2 real quick, because we're told this of Jesus. Man, this is ridiculous. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition, have this mind among yourselves. Read Philippians 2. It's actually going to be your homework. Even though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality or consider equality with God a thing to be what? Grasped, seized, involving the hand, overreaching, right? Even though for him it would have been right. And this doesn't deny the divinity of Jesus. It actually further amplifies the beauty of what he did as God when he laid down his life and went to the cross. And it stands as a counter image to Genesis chapter 3 and the majority of the nation of Israel and their religious system. And I want to link this to another story, one of the most classic examples, in my opinion, of an overreach of power out of rebellion to God is in 1 Kings 13, verse 4. Go read that on your own. Coincidentally, that story involves a man having his hand is withered as God's judgment against him. So the consequence for his sin and overreach is that his hand is that because he says, seize the prophet. It's a crazy story. And God actually causes his hand to wither as judgment. Go read that. It'll further validate everything we're looking at here. But here's where we end. Verse 14, the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. So I think the man reaching out his hand in faith and obedience on the Sabbath, engaging in the work of God, which God is inviting people to partner with him in, that whole situation stands as a contrasting image to the majority of Israel, where Jesus is looking for faith, he ain't finding it. So here's the last observation. Number 7 is the rebellious leaders. The Pharisees just hate him. They wanted to accuse him, twist his words. It just escalates, man. But I want us to consider how they, in their conspiring and desire to kill him, they are like King Saul. When David is on the run for his life, right? David is conspiring. How do I kill and capture David? David is the one whom God has anointed for the throne. Saul's kingdom is fading. His throne is coming to an end. His reign is definitely reaching its expiration date. So it's as though the religious leaders are in the place of King Saul in this situation, while Jesus is the greater David. It's as though, like Saul, their throne, their power and authority is being taken and given to another. As we'll see that language of kingdom and throne and authority being transferred, we'll see that language in the next section with the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, about Jesus plundering the kingdom of darkness and taking back what is rightfully his. It's a kingdom transfer of authority and power back to the rightful ruler God has installed. And taken. That's why Jesus will say in the parable of the vineyard tenants, the kingdom of God is being taken from you and being given to a people producing its fruits. But somehow they see God in the flesh with all his miraculous power and divine authority, and they still want to kill him. Like, that's how dark and corrupt many of these religious elite have grown. And this will escalate in the next section, where their unbelief and rejection becomes even more unreasonable, like irrational animals. So there is more I'd like to share about this passage for us to reflect on and apply to our own lives. This video is long enough, so I'm going to put that video, that follow-up teaching, on the exclusive video section of our website for monthly supporters as my way of saying thank you. And in that video, I'll walk you through some key application points and reflection questions, and we'll reflect on this wisdom. So if you're a monthly supporter, I'll see you there. And if you'd rather just download all of our notes and go through them yourself, you're more than welcome to do that, because those are also available to our monthly partners. So thank you guys. If you're not a monthly supporter, you can become one today. But here's some homework I have for you. I want you to cross-reference in your own quiet time. Just go through these passages. 1 Corinthians 6, Paul talks about what is lawful. 1 Corinthians 10, all things are lawful. Another statement. 1 Kings 13 is King Jeroboam and his hand withering. Genesis 3, man reaching out to take what is forbidden. And then Philippians 2, Jesus does not reach out his hand, even though he has every right to do so. He humbles himself to the point of death on a cross. So in the next section, what we're going to see is an Old Testament prophecy come up in Isaiah, which speaks about the Messiah and his miracles and his work. And you wonder, why does this quotation right here follow the miracle with the withered hand? Why does it sound like a kind of prophetic judgment against that generation of Jesus? Because I think it does. You'll have to wait to the next video to find out. In the meantime, though, like this video so more people can find it, and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and then leave a comment letting me know what you think the withered man and the withered-handed man represents, possibly, based on your reading of Scripture. And I will see you guys in the next video. Hey, if you're not a monthly supporter yet of this ministry, here's why you'll want to become one today. You get access to exclusive teachings every week. Right now, I'm going through Genesis, looking at the Hebrew and drawing out deeper insights. You'll get access to all of my biblical parallel worksheets. And there are other benefits for higher tiers, like unlimited access to all of my sermon notes, free access to paid Bible courses, and even early access to weekly Bible teachings. So go check that out on the website, and thank you for supporting this ministry to help us teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. I'll see you in the next video.